we just need to wake ourselves up before we get into the heavy material of how we deal with spatial intelligence. Yeah. So this group starts. You're coming in when they're taking the pause, right? Let's try it. Are you up? You there? Wait, right? Could you pick up the difference in the pauses? Yeah? Okay, rhythm. So rhythm deals with spatial awareness. What's so fascinating about this area is we think spatial awareness has to do with outer space. But today, we want to get to an understanding that really connects education to medicine to business. Whether we're talking about little kids or seniors, we want to actually we want to start looking at how these areas are intersected. And the research I'm presenting comes from the institute I started, and specifically research that my neuroscience advisors, Dr. Véronique Bobo from McGill and Dr. Merznerek, who's here today, have inspired me to really focus in on this area. So I'm going to ask everyone to please stop for a moment and, if you will, close your eyes and remember the last toilet you sat on today or stood up from, yeah? So please imagine the bathroom that you were in today, yeah? And if you would, please imagine how you got there. So picture how you got to that seat, yeah? Picture the materials on the wall, the actual quality of the touch of your relationship to the toilet seat, the space around you. Maybe you remember the scent, okay? Yeah? Whether your feet touch the floor or not, for those short people in the room like me, yeah? You're welcome to open your eyes now. So Jack Sim, my colleague in Singapore, has started the World Toilet Organization. And, it's quite seriously, and he's going to developing countries and helping figure out what are going to be the future toilets. Now, if you go to the QVB, they've got some pretty hip toilets, right? Yeah, amazing toilets, right? And even the architecture, it's very, very Libeskind-like in terms of strange angles. Well, so just the ability to remember where you've been in space is probably one of the most critical survival skills that we have as human beings. And it's very, very core learning, adaptive learning when we're children. And just talking to Dr. Merz, half an hour ago, says, seniors lose their adaptive abilities. They get older, they get very rigid, particularly in spatial awareness. So what we have to talk about today is this problem that we have about learning to navigate our world, how actually the mindfulness and yogic practices that have been taught, the martial arts practices, are so central to bringing awareness to that, as well as the arts, and particularly what that means for growing hippocampus. So the rock star of the discussion today in neuroscience is really the hip hippocampus. We've got 3 big ideas, because we chunk in 3. It's a great learning lesson for you teachers. Chunk in 3 for memory, yeah? We want to understand how spatial intelligence actually develops memory. The fact that you could even remember the toilet is already a magnificent display of your memory capacity. Yeah? Second, what we have to understand about our ability to grow memory, specifically through spatial intelligence, is that it grows brain tissue. It actually grows neural networks. And if we don't use it, the take-home message is we truly lose it. And that's not good for the implications of Alzheimer's, and that's not good for early brain development. In prenatal studies done by Dr. Véronique Bobo, she's been able to show with her colleagues that the stress that pregnant moms go through actually impact the brain development of their children later on as they grow up. So we have to understand then the third big idea, which is that in addition to developing memory, in addition to growing tissue, that we need the senses to do this, and that the hippocampus is an area that allows you to process and consolidate all the sensory networks they use for seeing, hearing, smell, taste, touch, movement. So my question to all of us in this room and why I asked you what your backgrounds are so I know to whom I'm speaking, is who doesn't use spatial intelligence? Who doesn't use the very core network capacity that we've used to actually evolve in nature, to the degree that Mark Chinganzi, right, who wrote a book called Harness, claims that it's not that we evolved our brains for music and language. No. We evolved, and curiously enough, by using spatial movement and spatial awareness, the brain has actually extrapolated from that practice, from that brain network, to actually develop music and language capacities. It's counterintuitive. So who doesn't use spatial intelligence? Well, in the design world, all the designers are using it, yeah? Web, game, product design, industrial design, and fashion. Just the basic arts. We've talked, we do lots of lip service. Let's get the arts back. But if we thought about it from the neuroscience point of view, we would really understand this incredible gift, this whole brain gift, that the arts actually bring into developing spatial reasoning, spatial logic, spatial awareness. All of the mindfulness practices, particularly the body practices, the integration practices that bring mind-body together, demand spatial awareness and learning. My chess players in the room, the footy players, the water polo players, right? My hockey players and baseball players, capacity to use spatial awareness, spatial reasoning. And let's not forget our mathematicians. And I don't mean calculation. I'm talking about the ability to reason and rotate images of planes in space, of engineers and cartographers and military strategists and astronauts. In speaking to the man that trains actually astronauts to go up, he said that on the ships you'll see arrows outside, and these arrows are so that when the astronauts are actually floating in this different gravitational field, they know which way is up. Yeah? Kind of like surfers. Who are my surfers in the room? I mean, surfers? Yeah. When the water comes and the wave comes and you lose your way, you use a major practice we'll be talking about, which is called landmarking. So we've got surfers are using spatial intelligence, and even the new robotic, the Da Vinci robotic skills of surgeon putting their hands into virtual reality extension prosthetics are having to use spatial reasoning to know where to pick up tissue. Yeah? Who doesn't use spatial intelligence? We all do. It's part of the gift of being human. So if everybody could please rise, we're going to practice the Ruby Slipper game, so please rise. Now, I don't know how many of you grew up with Wizard of Oz, but I learned all of my mental, my mindfulness and my guided imagery practice from that film, yeah? So we want to, our feet are together, right? Our feet are together, right? We close our eyes, we click our heels 3 times, right? And we just say, there's no place like home. 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 And if you will, in this position, please picture your bedroom that you slept in as a child. So if you could remain standing, and just see the bedroom that you slept in when you were a child. Notice if there was a window, notice where it is in the room. Notice the entrance to your room. Did you have to walk upstairs? Or did you walk downstairs to get to your bedroom? And which direction was your bed facing? Was it facing north, south, east, or west on the axis? And do you remember which direction your head was when you slept? Which cardinal direction? Were you sleeping with your head north, south, east, or west? And then take a breath, please. Let that image go. And then one more image. See the bedroom you now sleep in. And is it set up in any relationship that bears to your early childhood bedroom? Is the bed in the same area? Are you sleeping in the same direction? Does it face the same direction of light? Just take note of that. And with another breath, you can open your eyes and let yourself sit. Thank you. So, how many people could see their childhood bedroom? Okay. And with that childhood, one question then is, did any feeling arise when you see that bedroom? Any quick memory follow from that? Okay. So, we just practiced spatial memory. We just went back to a place that we actually know quite well, right? That it's been a long time. And we actually have feelings attached to that. Freud would have loved the research on spatial intelligence, right? Because he was very interested in associative learning, yeah? And what we learn about going back to our early childhood is that we find that all memory is spatial. And Dr. Merz says we hang our memories on the curtain of space and time. Now, in all great literature, we're involved in wayfinding, whether it's Harry Potter or it's Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz in terms of children's films. You can think about all great literature of the hero's journey as trying to find their way home. And they're forced to actually navigate space. They lose their way. Think about Frodo having to actually go and get rid of the ring and the problem he had being led by the Gollum and trying to find his way, and they had to leave breadcrumbs. He was practicing landmarking, yeah? So wayfinding is the term that neuroscientists use to develop the thinking around spatial and episodic memory. Notice those words. Spatial memory, right? Things that are outside, beyond our bodies, as well as the experience of being in body. Episodic is a time word. It's the kairos we discussed in terms of special moment, but it's actually just not, it's more ubiquitous moment, meaning things that happen in time-space. Happens at the level of memory, it's recruited at the level of memory, and it's connected to all the sensory experiences that were happening at that moment. The fascinating thing about this, when you actually look at the neuroscience research, is that spatial awareness is actually not a sensory faculty. It's said to be a cognitive map. A cognitive map. What that means is you're consolidating everything you're picking up at the sensory level. The scent of the bathroom, the vision of the bedroom, the hearing of mom's voice, the churning of internal feelings in your stomach of feeling like there's snakes on the floor. Some of you, I remember when I was a child. Right? All that is consolidated in the hippocampus as a map of relationship. So what we find in studying neuroscience is we recognize that we're moving away from a part-to-whole relationship in discussing the brain, and we're moving more to a network view, which is a really great model because then it works very nicely with computational and algorithmic systems that help us work with computer technologists. So we can advance the science by working with a network approach as opposed to a parts to whole. Dr. Ramachandran mentioned that moving away from an older mechanistic model. So when we're talking about spatial memory and cognitive mapping, we're talking about the whole brain. The whole brain working in a network fashion. This should free us. This should free us from thinking it has to be essential happening in one place. Yeah? For the philosophers in the room. That's for the philosophers in the room. Yeah? Now, the other thing I think is very, very sweet about studying spatial intelligence and spatial memory, particularly when we're talking about learning, is that it's happening not just at the network level, but it's actually happening at the place level, at the level of place and cells. Whether you read Dr. Eric Kandel, who was one of the early researchers and as well as Lynn Nadell in New Mexico, trying to describe how do you think about spatial intelligence, particularly in terms of growth of memory, you find that they talk about it at the cellular level. Same thing with Christoph Koch in his discussion of consciousness. You go to this cellular level. So now we've got this complexity. We're dealing with networks and we're dealing with cells. Now, place cells are literally the cells that configure when we actually step right here. Remember when we were kids and we jumped over cracks? That's igniting place cells. Okay? Grid cells, for you geometry buffs in here, are really fascinating cells They were discovered to actually tessellate. They form an actual set of triangles, proving, for the philosophers again, that Kant was right. We have this ability to actually see the world in grid, and it doesn't even come from our experience. It actually has evolved over time. I know, blows you away, right? Doesn't it? That we are actually, that we've evolved this system that shows at the level of neurological mapping a kind of tessellated figure that grids. So we actually, it's not a surprise that we actually impose grids on space. Whether that's good for us remains another story, but we do that, yeah? So we've got two kinds of cells. We have grid cells and we have place cells. And these are operating in relationship to what I love to call, when I work with children, hippocampus, right? The hippocampus gives us our worldview, okay? It allows us to learn new things. It converts short to long-term memory, and it recalls spatial location and relations. It is, you could say it's the central processor for all kinds of experiences that we want to embed in our memory. Okay? It's world relationship, as distinct from the powerful parietal network that Dr. Ramachandran mentioned in his phantom limb studies, where he was speaking specifically about body-centric orientation. And the parietal network actually deals with number sense. So for math learning, it's been showing up in muchness. How much is 2 plus 2? Yeah? How much is 2? How much is 2? Yeah? It also shows up in spatial pattern relations, how I can see the distinction between the actual shape of this side of the audience to the width and proportion of this scale of the audience. And in fact, it also shows up in attention orientation. So in surfing, and the images from Brown Girl Surf, which is this new cool project a colleague of mine is generating by interviewing surfers in developing countries who've broken away from culture that resists women to surf, right? You notice the kneel, right? Her ability to stay and focus, right? Because she doesn't want to dump, yeah? So attention orientation, that's parietal. So we've got hippocampus, yeah? That actually allows for novelty of learning new things. That's what Michael Gelb was speaking about. That's what Helena was speaking about. This is the area that helps us learn new things. We convert the short to long term, and we actually recall spatial location, where we were. So stop for a moment and think about your own experience of a recent memory, of recalling a recent memory of a friend you've seen that you may have not seen in a while or spoken to. And notice what comes up in terms of space. Do you remember the place? Do you remember what he or she was wearing? Do you remember how they were standing? In other words, you don't see them isolated, right, in a box. You see them in relationship to the whole, right? And that's our project in education, in business, in developing new products, right, to use to help people navigate and to orient. And we have to come up to the white elephant in the room, which is GPS systems. Right? So, right, how many people use GPS systems? Yeah, okay, shrinking hippocampus here, okay? All right, yeah. Yeah. Dr. Bobo is very concerned about that. You can look her up on Google. It's a big study she did in looking at the effects of GPS systems on the developing hippocampus. And it is not a good picture for what's happening to us when we only look at the screen. So you know this, right? You know this one, this movement, right? 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 We know this one, right? So that's a problem. That's a problem because we're orienting to the screen and not to our world. Yeah? So we're diminishing the use of networks that have been evolved over thousands of years. So how present-centered are we? Yeah? And by the way, I'm not a Lumpet Pro, I love tech, but we're talking about relative terms, yeah? How present-centered are you? So today we've got to address the white elephant. The first white elephant is, how do we handle the fact that we're starting to move all of our probe attention practices to the screen? And we're only relying on habits. So the fact that I can walk like this and make sure that I don't bump into this, right, is previous knowledge. Yeah, previous knowledge that I won't hurt myself. Yeah. And the question is, how do we do that? Bobo says that this is a difference not just in terms of learning, but strategic learning, distinct from habitual response. And so you have to look at the hippocampus in relationship to other areas. And she said, well, look, just go look at the striatum and the basal ganglia areas, right? An area that deals with what's called the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus sits above the hippocampus in the deep centers of the brain. And the caudate nucleus is known for learning and memory, but specifically habit and rehearsal and feedback systems. So the difference here is learning a new skill. Like yesterday, we all tried to juggle, yeah? How many people had juggled for the first time yesterday? Right, so learning new things, yeah? It was a really good example of using hippocampus to learn. How many people had juggled for many years and knew it really well? A few. Okay, so you didn't have to rely so much on hippocampus. You were relying on habit, yeah, in terms of the practice. The challenge is when you actually ask people to spatial navigate, many people will, in terms of navigation, will rely on caudate nucleus strategy and not on hippocampus. What does this mean for us? It means the reduction or the expansion of gray matter in our brains. This is really important, gang, because we're really talking about the healthy brain. And we're talking about practices that we can use to grow brain as opposed to shrink brain, right? So just like muscle, if you don't use it, it atrophies. Same thing with gray matter, it's going to atrophy. And in Veronique's research, actually these are rat studies that are then statistically worked out to look at the scale it would fit a human study, as well as looking at human studies in terms of the impact of stimulus and spatial. We find that if you use spatial, and what's an example of spatial? So let's go back to what we just did earlier today. Good example. What is a spatial strategy? When I asked you to remember your bedroom, how many people remembered your bedroom based on where the light was in your room? A few. How many people remembered the bedroom based on the size of your bed? Few. How many people remember your bedroom based on where your bed was placed in the room? More. Okay, more. Where it was, okay? So where it was, we could say we could think of that as a landmark. The bed is over to the left as opposed to the right, okay? You walk in Darling Harbor for some of the food. Go upstairs, the more edible food, okay? So you go up, forgive me, I'm sorry, but it's been my experience here. So you go upstairs and, you know, the elevators are going, you know, the escalators are going in lots of different directions. How do you know how to get back to the convention center and not get lost and go to the Maritime Museum if you're not a Sydneyite? Yeah? What do you use? Do you look at the stores? How many people look at the stores? Should be mostly women. Some guys are doing that. Great. Okay. So in studies looking, by the way, in terms of who uses spatial memory strategy, landmarking, which we're describing, which is a strategy, not a crutch, guys, not a crutch, a strategy, okay? That actually is used more by women. Men tend to use an internal monitor of how to navigate space in terms of cardinal signs that they've learned. And guys, studies have done at the age early as 3 years old, showing that boys tend to develop spatial intelligence before girls, okay? Girls come in later. Implications for math, music, sports, lots of discussion we can have there, right? So the strategy of remembering where things are, specifically by a landmark, that is a strategy. Some of you came to the convention center because you already knew the path. How many people just came without landmarking at all? How many people walked here today and knew exactly where you're going because you'd done it once? Yeah, once. It only took you once and you already knew where you're going, right? That's about habit. You might be using some peripheral vision to know where you are, yeah? The fact that we have this recording is the sophistication and rapidity of how quickly we learn. So in Bobo's research, we need to use the strategy to grow hippocampus, because if we're not using strategy, we're not using hippocampus, okay? So I've got a little time left, yeah? So I want to just tell you very quickly about a project, the way we talk about this with children, because I teach college kids to go into primary schools and help children learn about neuroanatomy and learn some neuroscience techniques, particularly for research purposes. So we have a project called Neurons and Neutra. where we brought the research of a famous architect together with the practice of spatial memory. This is Richard Neutra, the Kaufman House, very famous house in Southern California in Palm Springs. And we asked children, how do you think Richard Neutra developed the actual scale and proportion of that house? And how did he know how to place it in relationship to the mountain so it could be quite beautiful? Well, there happened to be a Tim Burton show on at the same time. And we knew that some kids like narrative more than geometry. So we brought Tim Burton's work in because Tim has these great drawings of Alice going on the hole, and you can actually do spatial proportion studies in relationship to that. So we also brought in the Alvy Ailey because we knew that the students we were working with, African American, liked dancing. And we want them to get the language of space. Yeah? We want them to get the language of space. In, out, up, down. Now, in terms of the kind of talk I've heard here, bless you, I've heard lots of people talking about how they need to go on and make design thinking. I say use the arts. They're the easiest thing in the world to actually get projects going, right? First of all, they're great looking. We have great slides, okay? And you can do stuff, right? You can do stuff, right? So take home message, what did we learn today? We are bodies in space. We use our spatial intelligence to do what? We develop memory, right? Next thing, we grow tissue, right? Right? And third, we're going to integrate our senses. So implications, let me just give time for implications. One, strategy, not habit, right? Think about the online potential of this and experiential learning to stretch spatial imagination, right? And cognitive mapping. Think of all of the practices we could use to enhance that. Finally, how do we integrate this with the actual social emotional intelligence, the brain-mind practices? Lots for us to talk about. I want to say thank you to everyone. I'm so grateful to be here. Find me on Twitter. Adios.